The room smelled faintly of old wood and polished keys, the kind of smell that made people feel calm, even sleepy. It was the kind of room that had hosted countless piano lessons, recitals, and quiet practice sessions over the years. For most people, it was just a room with a piano at one end, chairs arranged in a semicircle, and a few music stands. But for her, it was a place where she felt both excitement and anxiety, a mixture she had learned to live with since childhood. She walked in quietly, her bag over one shoulder, and set it down gently. She didn't want to make a sound, didn't want to draw attention. She was the kind of person who preferred blending in, the kind of student teachers often overlooked, thinking they were quiet because they were unsure, not realizing sometimes quietness was a sign of focus. Today was just another lesson, or so everyone thought. The instructor glanced at her as she walked in, a faint smile playing across his lips. He had a way of sizing up students in seconds, deciding what they could or couldn't do. Most of the students in this room were regulars, kids and young adults who had been learning for years. Their hands were confident on the keys, their eyes quick to follow the sheet music. They smiled at each other, chatting casually before the lesson began, but she stayed silent, finding a spot on the edge of the room where she could observe without being noticed as she sat down. She noticed a few of the students glance her way, their expressions mild curiosity, mixed with the faintest hint of amusement. They had seen her before, sure, but she wasn't the kind of student who stood out. She was polite, diligent, and always prepared, but she never sought attention. It wasn't that she didn't want to play well. She just didn't feel the need to impress anyone unnecessarily. That was her secret. No one really expected much from her, and somehow that made her feel both safe and invisible. The instructor cleared his throat and began the lesson. Today, they were reviewing basic techniques, scales, and finger exercises. Most of the students went through their motions easily, the notes flowing almost automatically from their fingers. Some of them exchanged quick smiles when they got a particularly tricky part right. A silent competition that wasn't meant to be mean but was there anyway. She listened quietly, her eyes on the keys, her fingers hovering above them, feeling the piano's presence rather than thinking about it. The room was filled with small sounds, the tapping of fingers on keys, the rustle of sheet music, the occasional soft sigh of concentration. She had been here many times, in countless lessons, and she knew the routine by heart, but there was something different today. She felt a small thrill, a tiny spark of anticipation, though she didn't fully understand why. Maybe it was the way the sunlight fell through the tall windows, highlighting the dust in the air like tiny golden stars. Maybe it was just her own nerves, the familiar butterflies that came whenever she sat at a piano she cared about. When the instructor called her name, she looked up briefly and nodded, moving to the piano at the front of the room. The other students watched her with mild curiosity, expecting her to play a simple exercise, maybe stumble a little and then finish quickly. That was usually what happened. She didn't mind. Expectations were low, and she liked it that way. She liked having the freedom to play without anyone hovering, without anyone expecting brilliance on command. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling the smooth, cold surface under her fingers. She closed her eyes for a brief moment and let herself breathe, letting the silence of the room settle around her. The instructor nodded, watching, perhaps wondering if today would be any different. If she would follow the usual path of quiet diligence or surprise him in some small way. The room seemed still, the air holding its breath along with her. There was no rush, no pressure, just the piano, the music, and the tiny space she carved out for herself in this familiar place. She began with a simple scale, one that everyone expected her to play mechanically. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, each note clean, precise, and unhurried. But even in something so ordinary, there was a subtle control, a fluidity that came from years of careful attention and quiet practice at home. From the eyes of anyone who might judge. The other students continued their own exercises, glancing occasionally, noticing nothing extraordinary. To them, she was just another student doing what was expected, doing it well enough but not standing out. After the scales, the instructor handed her a short piece, something straightforward, a common selection for this level. He assumed she would follow it literally, hitting the right notes, keeping time, and finishing without incident. That was the standard. That was what he expected. She took the sheet music, her fingers brushing lightly over the page, and nodded, ready to begin. She didn't rush. She didn't fidget. She simply started to play. The first few notes were careful, deliberate. The kind of notes a student might play when they were being watched closely. The instructor leaned slightly forward, as if inspecting the mechanics of her hands, counting on the usual mistakes or hesitations. A few of the students turned their heads, not out of genuine interest, but curiosity, a brief pause in their own routines. They expected the familiar, the ordinary, the quiet demonstration of competence that didn't disrupt the flow of the lesson. But she was not here to be ordinary today. She had practiced in secret for moments like this, honing her understanding of the piece, feeling every phrase, every pause, every rise and fall of the music. The first few notes were her way of finding the room, the keys, the rhythm, aligning herself with the instrument she had spent so many hours learning to understand, and then, almost imperceptibly at first, the music began to transform. The instructor's eyes flicked up, sensing the subtle change, but he said nothing, curious now despite himself. The students began to notice, too, the faint shift in tempo, the way the notes seemed to carry more emotion, more weight, more intention. She didn't play faster or louder. She played differently, with awareness, with purpose. Each note connected to the next, creating a delicate thread that pulled the listener in without them realizing it. She could feel it, the small vibrations, the resonance in the room, the way the air seemed to respond to her touch. Her heart beat steadily, a quiet accompaniment to her fingers, matching the rhythm she created. She was no longer just a student following instructions. She was a storyteller, using the piano to convey thoughts and feelings she didn't yet have words for. She was aware of the eyes on her now, but she did not look up. She did not need to. The music itself spoke, demanding attention in a way that simple performance rarely did. A few students shifted in their chairs, trying to understand what was different, trying to find the mistake or the trick. There was none. Everything was deliberate, precise, intentional. The instructor, who had been so confident in his assessment of her abilities, felt a flicker of surprise, a recognition that perhaps he had underestimated her. But still, he remained quiet, allowing the music to unfold, curious to see where it might lead. She played through the piece, each phrase a small revelation, each chord a gentle assertion of her presence. She did not rush the tempo. She did not overplay. She did not seek applause. She was entirely immersed, present in the sound, in the moment, in the room that had seemed ordinary just minutes before. The other students watched, silent now, some leaning forward, drawn to the subtle power in her performance. The room itself seemed to listen, the air holding every note, every pause, every nuance. When she finished, she lifted her hands slowly from the keys, letting the final note linger in the air. The room was quiet, almost stunned. Not a word was spoken at first. The instructor leaned back, his expression unreadable, a mix of surprise, curiosity, and perhaps a hint of admiration. The students exchanged glances, realizing that what they had just witnessed was something more than a routine lesson. Something ordinary had become extraordinary, and it had happened quietly, without fanfare, without announcement, simply because she had chosen to give it her full attention. For her, it was just another lesson, another opportunity to play. Another day spent at a piano she loved, but for those who had underestimated her, the lesson had changed. Expectations had shifted. The quiet student who blended into the background had made them pause, made them listen, made them reconsider what they thought they knew. And she, sitting back in her chair, felt that small, quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had shared a part of herself through the music, without needing anyone to notice immediately. The room would remember this moment, even if the students didn't realize it yet, and she would continue to play quietly, deliberately, and with the awareness that sometimes the simplest lessons could surprise the world. After her quiet yet powerful performance, the room slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The other students began their exercises again, but there was a subtle shift in the air. Eyes that had barely noticed her before now glanced in her direction with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. The instructor, usually calm and composed, seemed to watch her more closely than before, as if he had suddenly realized that she was not the quiet, ordinary student he had assumed her to be. There was a new energy in the room, a tension that came from a sudden awareness that something unexpected had just happened. She sat back in her chair, allowing her fingers to rest on her lap for a moment. Her heart was still beating a little faster than usual, but not from fear or anxiety. It was the thrill of being fully present, fully engaged, and fully herself. She felt proud, but not in a way that sought recognition. The pride was quiet, personal, and deeply satisfying. She had shared something real, something that mattered, and it had been received even if no one had applauded. That small, silent victory was enough. The instructor cleared his throat, breaking the silence.
That was
different, he said carefully, choosing his words. There was no criticism, no judgment, only an acknowledgement that something unusual had occurred. Let's continue with the lesson, he added, but his tone had changed. There was now a hint of respect, a recognition that she might be capable of more than he had originally assumed. The other students exchanged quiet whispers, trying not to be obvious. Some looked impressed, others confused, and a few even seemed a little uneasy. It was not common for someone so quiet and unassuming to suddenly command attention without effort. Most of the students had been focused on their own progress, their own small achievements, and suddenly they realized that there was someone among them who had quietly been mastering something far beyond the surface. It was a subtle reminder that talent was not always loud, and that appearances could be deceiving. As the lesson continued, she noticed that the instructor was giving her more thoughtful attention. He asked her questions that went beyond the technical aspects of the piece, probing her understanding of the music, her approach to phrasing, and her interpretation of rhythm and emotion. It was clear that he wanted to see how she thought, how she felt about what she was playing, rather than just how accurately she could follow the sheet music. This was new territory for her, and she welcomed it. She had always been willing to learn. But now the learning felt different, more personal, more connected to her own voice and expression. The other students, sensing the subtle change in the instructor's attention, became more aware of their own playing. Some started to doubt themselves, realizing that technical skill alone was not the only measure of talent. There was a quiet ripple of tension and curiosity, a mix of admiration and challenge. They had not expected this, and it was unsettling in a way that forced them to reconsider their own approach. She noticed some of them glancing at her, as if trying to read a secret she was keeping, but she simply focused on the keys, the music, and the connection between her mind, her fingers, and the sound. When it came time for another exercise, she felt a small thrill of anticipation. The instructor handed her a new piece, slightly more complex, with subtle shifts in tempo and dynamic markings that required careful attention. Most students would approach it mechanically, playing the notes as written without much thought, but she approached it differently. She read the music not just with her eyes, but with her mind and heart, feeling the intention behind each mark, imagining the story the composer wanted to tell. Her fingers moved with purpose, expressing ideas and emotions that went beyond the notes on the page as she played. She noticed the subtle reactions around her. The instructor leaned forward slightly, a small sign of engagement and interest. The other students paused their own practice, listening without meaning to, caught by the unexpected depth of her playing. She could sense the shift, the subtle change in how they perceived her, but she did not let it distract her. She was absorbed in the music, lost in the flow of sound, each note a thread connecting her to something larger than herself. There was a moment when a particularly challenging passage came up, a series of rapid notes that required precision and control. Her fingers moved smoothly, almost effortlessly, finding the rhythm and balance needed to convey the music accurately while still maintaining expression. It was not a display of speed or showmanship. It was a display of understanding, a quiet mastery that revealed itself without arrogance. She felt the satisfaction of meeting a challenge, not for recognition, but for the fulfillment that came from doing something well and meaningfully. The instructor observed closely, occasionally nodding in approval, but not interrupting. He was testing her, seeing how she responded under subtle pressure. It was a delicate balance. He did not want to overwhelm her, but he also wanted to gauge her potential. She responded with patience and calm focus, demonstrating a level of self-discipline and awareness that was rare, even among the more advanced students. The room seemed to hold its breath again, silent witness to the quiet unfolding of skill and dedication. As she continued, she noticed a few of the other students exchanging glances. There was a mixture of respect, surprise, and perhaps a little envy. They had seen many students before, some talented, some diligent, but few who combined both technical skill and emotional expression so naturally. She did not play to impress them, yet her performance had a quiet power that could not be ignored. She was aware of the effect she was having, but she did not let it alter her focus. Her priority was always the music, the story it told, and the connection it created. By the time she reached the final section of the piece, her playing had become more fluid, more expressive. The music seemed to breathe, rising and falling with intention, carrying a subtle emotional weight that resonated in the room. The instructor watched closely, clearly impressed, but he did not speak. He understood that some lessons were not measured by words, but by presence, by the impact that skill and expression could create. The other students were silent, absorbed despite themselves, drawn into a performance that had grown naturally from quiet dedication and careful practice. When she finished, she allowed the final note to linger, feeling it resonate through the room. The silence that followed was profound, almost reverent. No one immediately spoke or moved, as if they were collectively absorbing what had just occurred. It was more than a performance. It was a statement, a quiet declaration that talent and dedication were not always obvious, and that appearances could be misleading. The instructor finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying weight. "That was very well done," he said, a rare note of genuine acknowledgement. "You have a deep understanding of the music, and you express it beautifully." Her heart lifted slightly at the words, but she did not smile outwardly. The praise was not the goal. The satisfaction came from the process, from knowing she had shared something meaningful, something that mattered. She nodded politely, returning to her seat, feeling a subtle sense of accomplishment that was personal, private, and powerful. The lesson continued, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a new level of respect, a quiet awareness that she was capable of more than anyone had expected. The other students gradually resumed their practice. But the energy in the room was different now. They were more attentive, more thoughtful, more aware that skill and dedication could be quiet and unassuming yet still command attention. Some tried harder, motivated by the subtle example she had set, while others reflected quietly, reassessing their own abilities and approach. It was a small, slow shift, but it was there. She could sense it without needing to be told by the end of the lesson. She packed her bag calmly, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She thanked the instructor politely, and as she walked out of the room, she felt the familiar mix of satisfaction and quiet anticipation that always followed a good session. She knew that she had changed something, even if only subtly, in the minds of those who had underestimated her. The experience reinforced a truth she had learned long ago: patience, focus, and dedication could speak louder than words. And sometimes the quietest presence could leave the most lasting impression. As she stepped outside into the sunlight, the air felt different, lighter somehow. She smiled faintly, not for anyone else, but for herself. She had faced a moment of doubt and expectation, and had emerged quietly victorious. Not through loud declarations or dramatic gestures, but through the simple, steady power of skill, patience, and genuine expression. And she knew that the lessons she was learning extended far beyond the piano, shaping not just her music, but the way she approached challenges, expectations, and the world around her. The next lesson arrived quietly, like any other day. With students filing into the familiar room filled with the scent of polished wood and faint traces of music from previous sessions, the sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, illuminating the piano and scattering soft reflections on the floor. She arrived as usual, her bag slung over her shoulder, moving silently to her familiar spot at the edge of the room. The memory of her last performance lingered in her mind, not as pride but as motivation. She knew that today could be different, that today might bring a new challenge. And she felt ready. The instructor greeted the class, his tone measured, as if carefully choosing the right balance between encouragement and discipline. He glanced briefly at her, a small acknowledgement in his eyes, a hint that he remembered her last lesson and was now paying attention. The other students were already seated, some chatting softly, some flipping through their sheet music, but the energy in the room was different. There was a quiet tension, a subtle sense that something was about to shift, though no one could quite explain why. As the lesson began, students were asked to review a series of exercises, focusing on scales, timing, and technique. Her hands hovered over the keys, familiar and confident. She followed the instructions carefully, but she did not rush. Her playing was precise, measured, and deliberate, revealing a quiet depth that went unnoticed by most. The instructor moved among the students, checking their hands, adjusting posture, offering brief advice. When he reached her, he paused, watching closely. He asked her to play a simple piece first, expecting the usual performance, competent, accurate, but unremarkable. What he did not anticipate was how she would transform it. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. She began the piece as expected, following the notes accurately. But as the first few measures flowed, she allowed herself to feel the music fully. She let the emotions rise and fall naturally, letting the story behind the music guide her fingers. The room, usually alive with small noises and movements, seemed to grow quiet, the attention of everyone present drawn toward the sound. Her playing was no longer merely an exercise. It became a living, breathing experience. The other students noticed the difference immediately. The quiet, reserved student they had ignored just days ago was commanding the room with subtlety and grace. They leaned forward, their curiosity piqued, their own focus unintentionally shifting to her performance. Some exchanged glances, a mixture of surprise and awe, passing silently between them. They had never heard her play like this, and it was impossible to look away. Even the instructor, experienced and observant, could not hide the flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had assumed her abilities were limited to diligence and precision, not expressive depth, and now he was forced to reconsider. As she continued, the complexity of the piece grew. There were subtle changes in tempo, delicate shifts in dynamics, and unexpected pauses that required careful attention. Her fingers moved over the keys with a natural confidence, interpreting each mark with intelligence and emotion. She did not play faster or louder than necessary. Instead, she let the music unfold organically, revealing its meaning through careful phrasing and thoughtful timing. Each note seemed deliberate, each pause purposeful, creating a narrative that spoke directly to the listener's heart. The room was silent now. The usual shuffling and murmuring absent, students and instructor alike were captivated by the unfolding performance. It was not just skill that drew them in, but the quiet strength behind it. The combination of technical ability and emotional connection that made every note feel significant. She felt the energy of the room without letting it distract her, allowing it to heighten her awareness and focus. Every sound, every vibration seemed to guide her fingers, making the music more alive than it had ever been before at one point. A particularly challenging passage arrived, a rapid sequence of notes that demanded both precision and fluidity. Her hands moved with controlled speed, never rushing, never faltering, allowing the music to maintain its balance and emotional weight. The instructor leaned slightly forward, his interest fully engaged now, recognizing that her skill was not accidental. He had seen many students struggle with such passages, but she navigated it effortlessly, demonstrating mastery that went beyond technique. It was an unexpected revelation, a moment that redefined what he had assumed about her abilities. The other students watched, some with admiration, others with quiet jealousy. They had long assumed their own progress and talent were superior because she had remained quiet, unassuming, and seemingly ordinary. Now, the realization struck that she had quietly developed a depth and control that many of them had yet to reach. They felt a subtle shift in their own confidence, a recognition that appearances were misleading. and that true talent often hid behind modesty and patience. She continued, unbothered by their reactions, completely absorbed in the music, letting the room itself become a vessel for her expression. As she reached the middle section, the music took on a more complex, emotional quality. She allowed her feelings to influence her interpretation, blending technical skill with sensitivity and nuance. The instructor's eyes widened slightly, impressed by the way she conveyed meaning through subtle shifts in tone and tempo. Each note seemed to tell a story, capturing attention and evoking emotion without a single, exaggerated gesture. The students were now leaning forward almost instinctively, unable to ignore the quiet power of her playing. The music had transformed from a simple lesson into an experience that demanded presence and attention. There was a subtle magic in the way she moved through the piece. She did not force the sound, nor did she seek dramatic reactions. Instead, she allowed the natural flow of the music to guide her, letting her fingers respond intuitively to the story within each measure. She felt the weight of the notes, the rise and fall of each phrase, the gentle tension and release that the composer had intended. Every gesture, every subtle emphasis became a conversation between her, the instrument, and the listeners. The room seemed suspended in time, the outside world forgotten, as if the piano itself held them in a quiet embrace. As the performance progressed, the instructor began to notice details he had overlooked before. The way she anticipated each change in rhythm, the clarity of each chord, the subtle phrasing that conveyed emotion without exaggeration. All of it revealed a level of understanding and maturity beyond her apparent age or experience. He made a mental note to adjust his teaching approach, realizing that she required not just instruction, but guidance that challenged her expressive potential. He had underestimated her once, and he would not do so again. The other students were similarly affected. They had been distracted by their own assumptions, their casual judgments, and their desire to excel. Now, witnessing someone they had overlooked perform with such depth, they were forced to reflect. Some felt admiration, others a pang of humility, but all felt the undeniable power of her presence through music. Her performance had created a shared awareness, a quiet acknowledgement that skill, dedication, and emotional connection could not be measured by appearances alone. As she neared the final section, the music became even more expressive, blending technical demands with emotional depth. She played with care, letting each note resonate, allowing silence to hold meaning as much as sound. The room seemed to listen collectively, the air filled with subtle tension and anticipation. Every subtle shift in tempo, every carefully considered pause, communicated more than words ever could. She was not performing to impress. She was performing to express, to connect, and to honor the music itself. The conclusion of the piece arrived gently, without fanfare, but with profound presence. She let the final note linger, feeling its resonance fill the room, vibrating through wood and air alike. Silence followed, heavy and full of acknowledgement. The instructor leaned back, finally speaking with calm authority that was remarkable. "You have a rare understanding of both technique and expression. Continue to explore this depth, and you will accomplish great things." His words were measured, but the weight of recognition was unmistakable. The other students remained silent for a moment longer, processing what they had just witnessed. Some whispered quietly among themselves, still amazed, still reevaluating their assumptions. The quiet student who had seemed ordinary had, in a matter of minutes, shifted the perception of everyone present. They realized that talent could be subtle, and that dedication and patience often hid in plain sight. The lesson had transformed from routine to extraordinary. Leaving an impression that would linger far beyond the confines of the classroom, she returned to her seat calmly, her fingers resting lightly on her lap. She did not need praise or attention. The fulfillment was internal, the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had shared her music fully and authentically. She understood that lessons were not just about technique, but about connection, expression, and presence. Today had been another step forward, another demonstration of what patience, focus, and understanding could achieve. The room gradually returned to normal activity, but the shift in awareness had taken root. Everyone had witnessed something that day that could not be easily forgotten. A quiet reminder that appearances often hide true capability, and that dedication and heart speak louder than expectation. When the lesson ended, she packed her bag with calm precision, thanked the instructor, and left the room quietly. The sunlight greeted her outside, warm and welcoming. She walked slowly, reflecting on the lesson, not in terms of success or recognition, but in terms of understanding and growth. She knew that the path ahead would bring more challenges, more moments of doubt, and more opportunities to express herself. And she also knew that the quiet power of preparation, focus, and sincerity could turn ordinary moments into extraordinary experience. Following lesson felt charged in a way that was hard to describe. The room itself seemed different, as if it remembered her previous performances and held its breath in anticipation. Students filed in, some whispering to each other quietly, glancing her way with curiosity, others settling into their seats in thoughtful silence. She walked in, as usual, calm, collected, and unaware of the subtle ripple of attention she carried with her. The piano awaited, familiar yet expectant, as if it too recognized the energy she brought into the room. She placed her bag down and sat at her usual spot, her fingers brushing over the keys as she prepared for the lesson. The instructor began the session, but his tone was noticeably different. There was more focus, more observation, a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. He addressed the group with care, assigning pieces and exercises that challenged not only technical skill, but interpretation. She felt the weight of subtle expectation, the quiet curiosity in the room, and welcomed it. It was not pressure in a negative sense, but an acknowledgement that her abilities had grown. And now others were paying attention. The students began their exercises. Some eager to perform, some hesitant, aware that this lesson would feel different. They could sense something in her presence, a quiet intensity that spoke louder than words. She observed them briefly, noting their nervous energy, their attempts to measure themselves against someone who had quietly surprised them before. She understood their feelings, but did not allow them to disrupt her focus. Music had always been her anchor, her quiet sanctuary where judgment held no power, and she leaned on it as she prepared to play. When the instructor called her to the piano, there was a subtle shift in the room. Conversations halted, movements slowed, and a hush settled over the space. She moved to the instrument with deliberate calm, hands hovering above the keys. Sensing the tension and curiosity in the room, she began with a familiar piece, simple in appearance but rich in potential for expression. As she played, she let her awareness expand, feeling not only the keys beneath her fingers, but the way the sound traveled through the room, touching the walls, the air, and the ears of everyone present. The first notes were soft, deliberate, each carrying intention beyond mere accuracy. The students shifted in their seats, listening more closely than they had before, some with admiration, others with quiet envy, sure how to articulate the surprise they felt. The instructor, always precise in his observation, leaned forward slightly, noting subtle control in her phrasing, a refined sensitivity that revealed not just technical ability, but musical maturity. He had expected competence, but what he witnessed now went far beyond what he had anticipated. As she progressed through the piece, the complexity grew. Each chord, each scale, each pause was a conversation with the piano, a dialogue between her understanding and the instrument's voice. She allowed herself to explore subtle nuances, slight changes in tempo, gentle rises and falls in volume, all of which conveyed emotion without exaggeration. The room became a living space for music, a place where the ordinary could become extraordinary through the skill and presence of a focused musician. A particularly difficult passage arrived, testing her speed, precision, and composure. Her fingers moved with confidence and grace, navigating the sequence without hesitation. The room felt the intensity of her focus, as if her concentration radiated outward, pulling the attention of everyone present. The instructor watched closely, recognizing that her mastery was not simply the result of practice, but of deep understanding, intuition, and an emotional connection to the music. The students were silent, drawn into the moment, some unable to hide the awe on their faces. Midway through the piece, she allowed herself to immerse fully in expression. She did not play louder or faster than necessary. She played with intention, letting each note carry weight, each pause hold meaning. The students were captivated, leaning forward slightly, their own exercises momentarily forgotten. They felt the story unfolding in front of them, a story told without words, conveyed purely through sound and presence. The instructor, ever vigilant, nodded subtly, acknowledging her skill and understanding. He realized that she was teaching the room a lesson of her own, that music, when felt and understood, could surpass expectations and transform the ordinary into something memorable. Her playing continued to evolve, blending technique and emotion seamlessly. She shifted between subtle dynamics, intricate rhythms, and soft flourishes, each chosen carefully to convey intention. There was no exaggeration, no artificial showmanship, only authentic expression rooted in understanding. The room responded naturally, filled with attention and subtle energy. The air seemed to carry the music, every vibration reaching the listeners in a quiet, profound way. She felt it too, the connection between her and those who listened, the unspoken acknowledgement that something meaningful was happening. As she approached the final sections, her confidence remained steady. Each note was deliberate, each pause intentional. The room had become still, almost reverent, the students and instructor alike caught in the quiet power of her performance. She allowed herself a small inward smile, knowing that the music was alive and that her message was clear. She did not play for praise, applause, or recognition. She played for understanding, for connection, for the satisfaction of giving herself fully to the instrument and the moment. The last notes were gentle, lingering, resonating throughout the room with a soft echo that seemed to hold time still. Silence followed, dense and meaningful. No one spoke immediately, as if the space itself was honoring the performance. The instructor finally broke the silence, his voice calm but filled with genuine acknowledgement. That was remarkable. You have an understanding and control that is rare at any level. Continue to explore this depth, and your music will speak even further. His words were quiet, yet they carried weight, a validation of the quiet dedication she had demonstrated. The students, still processing what they had witnessed, whispered among themselves. Some expressed amazement, others quietly reflected on their own assumptions and approaches. It was clear that her performance had shifted perceptions, reminding everyone that talent could be subtle, skill could be hidden, and dedication could yield powerful, unassuming results. The lesson had transformed, moving from routine exercises to a shared experience of revelation and inspiration. After the final acknowledgement, she returned to her seat, letting her fingers rest lightly on her lap. She felt the internal satisfaction of a job done well, of music expressed authentically. There was no need for external validation. The quiet power of her focus and understanding was enough. She observed the subtle reactions of those around her, noting the way attention, curiosity, and admiration had quietly shifted. Her presence, once overlooked, was now acknowledged, though not loudly. And that acknowledgement was a quiet triumph. The rest of the lesson continued with normal exercises, but the atmosphere had changed irreversibly. Students were more attentive, more thoughtful, more aware of the subtleties of music and performance. The instructor moved among them, offering guidance, but the memory of her performance lingered, a reminder of the quiet strength that could transform ordinary moments. She participated calmly, focusing on her own growth and understanding, undistracted by the ripple she had caused. As the lesson concluded, she packed her bag carefully, thanked the instructor, and stepped out into the sunlight. The air outside felt warm and reassuring. She walked slowly, reflecting on the lesson and the subtle impact of her performance. She understood that music was more than practice, more than notes on a page. It was a way to communicate, to connect, and to reveal parts of oneself that words could not capture. Each lesson, each performance, each quiet moment of focus contributed to a larger journey, one that was shaping her skill, her presence, and her understanding of the world around her. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had shared something meaningful and that it had been recognized in a subtle, but profound way. Today had not been about applause or praise, but about understanding, connection, and growth. The lesson had been a reminder that patience, focus, and authenticity carried power, and that even the quietest presence could leave a lasting impression on those willing to notice. And as she walked away, she carried with her the sense that the journey was ongoing, that each moment of music, each careful choice of notes, was another opportunity to surprise, inspire, and communicate in ways that transcended expectation. The final lesson in this chapter arrived with a quiet anticipation that seemed to hang in the air. Students filed into the room as usual, but there was a sense of expectancy, subtle and almost imperceptible. The previous performances, the quiet transformations, and the recognition she had begun to earn had left a mark on the atmosphere. She walked in calmly, her bag over her shoulder, hands free from nervous gestures, and took her familiar seat. There was no outward display of pride or pretense, only a quiet readiness to face the lesson ahead. The instructor began with his usual measured tone, greeting the class and outlining the exercises and pieces for the day. His eyes lingered on her just slightly longer than on others, a silent acknowledgement of her growing influence and the skill he had come to respect. She listened carefully, her mind focused on the tasks, her fingers occasionally brushing the keys, anticipating the music that would flow from them. The other students sensed the subtle shift, feeling both curiosity and an unspoken challenge. The quiet student they had once overlooked now carried a presence that was undeniable, and it changed the way they approached the session as the lesson began. Students moved through scales, exercises, and short pieces. She followed along, precise and focused. But her mind was already moving toward the moment she would play her main piece for the session. There was no arrogance in her preparation, only a careful awareness and respect for the music. She allowed herself to feel the subtle tension in the room, understanding that the previous performances had set new expectations. Yet she remained calm, aware that her purpose was not to impress, but to communicate, to convey what music had taught her through quiet observation, practice, and patience. When the instructor called her to the piano, a hush fell over the room. The other students watched attentively, some with mild anticipation, others with admiration, or perhaps a hint of anxiety. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if she were aware of every step she took and every gesture she made. Sitting at the piano, she allowed her fingers to hover over the keys for a brief moment, feeling the instrument beneath her hands, sensing the room, and listening to the quiet expectations that hung in the air. Then she began to play.